Golden Doves, page 57 on the bottom of the page. This is class 103. I think I might be able to finish semiology and metaphysics. Let's see if we can do this. The best illustration of the change involved in the process of transmission is a theophany at Sinai. So we said that as you transmit, right, there is a change, and we explain what we mean by there is a change, right? And there's also transformations taking place between the way mitzvot were done and then the way the Torah instructs us to do the mitzvah, the dorot, right, as opposed to the way it may have been done at a particular moment. So if you look at Ma'amad al-Sinai, that's a great example of transformation. It is the most important event in the history of Israel, I would say. We can all agree about that. Indeed, Maimonides considers it the supreme instant in human history. The collective experience of God's speech by an entire nation. So that's the incredible thing. Because what happened in Ma'amad al-Sinai was, and this is the only recorded instance in history where there is even a claim that God spoke to the entire nation, right? So the entire nation experienced Hashem speaking to them in Ma'amad al-Sinai. How was this experience transmitted? So you have this incredible historical experience. Never happened before, never will happen after. How do we transmit it? It was transmitted through the radical Sinai to temple transformation. The theophany at Sinai is ever present in the sanctuary of Jerusalem. So the Bet HaMikdash is the transformation of Har Sinai. There's a transformation from Har Sinai to the Bet HaMikdash. I'm going to read to you the footnote number 56 on page 166. Harambam, and then Bet HaBechira. This one was further developed by Isaac Cardozo. La Excelencias de los Hebreos. And here's a quote from Isaac Cardozo's book. Mount Sinai represented what later would be the sanctuary or holy temple. So the Bet HaMikdash was an actual representation of Har Sinai. The Mishkan, just like the order was, first it was, of course, Har Sinai, then there was the Mishkan, so the transformation from Har Sinai to the Mishkan, and then from the Mishkan to the Bet HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. Mount Sinai represented what Israel would later, what later would be the sanctuary or holy temple. The people of Israel were secluded. Then Moses brought them to the foot of the mountain to meet the divinity. Right. So first you cut off the Jewish people. Right. So they cut themselves. The Keddashtem means they cut themselves off. The Arabic term used by the son of Harambam is kata. I don't know if he uses it in this context, but kata means to cut yourself off from everything around so that you can prepare for the processing of the presence of God. In order to process the presence of God, you need to cut yourself off from everything else, right? So that's the Keddashtem. Hayom Mahal Al Tigi'u El Isha. I'm sorry. Later on came Aharon and the 70 elders to the mountain by divine commandment. And finally, Moses went up alone to the most sublime. So you see how there's different parts? There's Azarat Yisrael, where well, it's not Ezrat Nashim, it's Azarat Nashim, please, Dachila. The people who are pronouncing it Ezrat Nashim, can you please pronounce it correctly? It's the Azarat. So it's Azarat Nashim, Azarat Yisrael. Okay. Anyway. So the Sinai was structured like the Bet HaMikdash. There's a portion where the Yisrael can be. Okay. Then there's a portion where only the Kohanim can be. And then there's a portion where the Kohen Gadol, only the Kohen Gadol can be. The Kohen Gadol in this case was represented by Moshe Rabbeinu, right? So Moshe Rabbeinu, he's like the Kohen Gadol. entering the Kodesh HaKodashim. That's the top of the mountain, right? But there was the Shirim Zekenim, there was the Aharon and Aaron's son. They were allowed further into the mountain, not up the mountain, but closer to the mountain. And finally, there was the rest of the people who were outside the mountain, right? But that place had a kedusha. In order to go to that outside portion of the Bet HaMikdash, or the outside portion of the Har Sinai, you had to be v'kedashtem hayom u'mahar, right? So you see the structural relationship between the Bet HaMikdash and Har Sinai. Likewise, at the temple, the people of Israel were in the court of the Azara, assembly hall of the Israelites. That's like I explained, I guess he's saying it. The priests were in the second temple, the Azara, assembly of the priests, Azarat Israel, Azarat Kohanim. And only the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKodashim. Okay, let us continue in the main text. In Jewish tradition, Mount Sinai is totally devoid of sanctity. Now, what happened to the Kedusha of Har Sinai? Back then, anybody who would come close to the mountain, ki yaro yiyare osakol yisaker, right? So you have to stay away from the mountain. What happened to the Kedusha? It's not there. The original Mount Sinai and the momentous event taking place in its midst were transferred to the tabernacle and then to the temple at Jerusalem. So the Kedusha that was in Har Sinai transferred itself to the Mishkan, and then it transferred itself to the Bet HaMikdash. Just as Bet El, the sanctuary consecrated by Yaakov Avinu, was transferred to the temple at Jerusalem. So Bet El, which is where Yaakov Avinu physically was that night, that Kedusha ends in Bet Elohim, Sha'at HaShamayim, that Kedusha. And then he says, I didn't know that this was a holy place, right? Right? It's Kodesh, Kodeshu. So he didn't know it was Kodesh. That Kedusha, what happened to that Kedusha? The Kedusha doesn't just disappear. It transfers or transforms into. So in this case, it transformed into the Kedusha of the Bet HaMikdash. More precisely, using the metaphor of the rabbis, Mount Moriah, Har Moriah, the future place of the temple at Jerusalem, jumped to meet Yaakov at Bet El before the patriarch had consecrated it, because the pasuk says, "Vayifga b'makom ki b'hashamesh." So the Chachamim say, literally, the Bet HaMikdash, or the place where the Bet HaMikdash is, Har Moriah, jumped to, so to speak, meet Yaakov Avinu, and Yaakov Avinu now was there. So the future Bet HaMikdash time traveled to the past, and Yaakov Avinu was suddenly in the future Bet HaMikdash. Transformation, and you notice this happens before Yaakov Avinu consecrates the place, right? So the Kedusha was there because the Kedusha of the future jumped to the past, and then afterwards, Yaakov Avinu, he consecrates the place as Kadosh. Transformation is not effected by reaching into the past from the perspective of the present, but rather by having the future anticipate the past and transform it before it becomes real. So that's enough for the Yaakov Avinu. So not asked to travel to the past, but rather asking the future to travel to you. That's the ma'ala of the Tzaddikim, right? And then they live within that holy, sacred, special future, right? Looking at the footnote 50. Similarly, according to the rabbis, Mount Sinai was originally a part of Mount Moriah, and it was removed from there and brought to the desert. That's beautiful. So, Har Moriah, which is where Yitzhak ne'ekan by Abraham Avinu Agabe HaMizbeach, that Har Moriah jumped to Har Sinai, the Jewish people received the Torah in Har Sinai, and then eventually it went back to Adam Moriah. The proceeding may be summarized as follows. At the cosmological, and this is the last paragraph in section 2, Semiology and Metaphysics. The proceeding may be summarized as follows. At the cosmological level, repetition encodes the first trace of creation and the ever-changing acts of providence. Every time the sun rises, that's the first sun rising. And then you have the second sun rising is connected the first one, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth. So every time you see sunrise, you say, Yoser or ubore choshech, right? And you say, Chadesh bechol yom tamid ma'aseh bereshit. God is repeating the creation, constantly repeating the creation, right? The created universe expresses the tension. The created universe expresses the tension between the infinite power of the Creator and the finite terms in which creation is realized. Right? So the universe is created. And there's a tension because Hashem his power is infinite. And so the creation is finite. Right? So there's this tension. In the act of creation, there's a tension between the infinite and the finite. This somehow parallels the tension between language, as oraculum, or golden doves apprehended from the perspective of the first person, and articulation of silver dots as perceived from the perspective of the second person. So you have that tension in speech. I have the ideality in my mind, the golden doves. I know exactly what I'm thinking. And it's a perfect thought, right? It's a beautiful thought. But I want to articulate it to you. So that's the silver dots. You understand the articulation will never be a perfect replica of the thought. It's going to be a repetition of the thought, right? But it's not identical to the thought. And there's a tension between the perfection of the thought and the less than perfect of the speech. Because so the first person is the thought. He pronounces the words. Second person hears the words. He doesn't see the golden doves. He experiences the silver dots. So Hashem is infinite. And he speaks the creation. And like the silver dots, the creation is finite. And it's not a perfect replica of whatever the ideality is. How could it be? So you see the tension between the infinite and the finite, between God's ideality, infiniteness, and God's speech, the creation, which is finite. As will be seen in the following chapter, at the linguistic level 2, we find ma'ana, significance, representing the unprocessed thought of the speaker, with sharah and sharah, articulation, which is apprehended by the addressee. So we have in Arabic, we distinguish between the sharah of the pasuk, which is the words, the actual lexical meaning of each word, and the ma'ana, which is the intended meaning of the words put together, which of course, as you know, is not always the same, right? That will be the next section. At the conceptual level, repetition is the ground for the idea of text and textuality. The subject of the fourth chapter. In order to have repetition, you need to have a text. Otherwise, what is it that you're repeating? That's chapter 4. Both these levels coalesce when considered semiologically. So we finished this section, Semiology and Metaphysics. Section 3, Freedom, Language, and Negativity. Introduction. The most peculiar aspect of the medieval thinker is that he developed his ideas around a text and expressed them as a commentary. That's interesting. So for medieval thinking, text was essential. In the Western world today, text has become completely marginalized. And so you automatically understand there's a difference between medieval thinking and modern Western thinking. This will be one of the things we will study about in freedom, language, and negativity.